Okay, it's the 29th of May 2006, and we are in Oslo, Norway, and we're interviewing our colleague, Professor Asbjørn Eide, at the Norwegian Institute of Human Rights as part of our Parents of the Field project. So, Professor Eide, thank you very much for speaking with us. I know that you've got a busy schedule. Okay, in the early days of peace and conflict research, back in the late 50s, the early 1960s, people came into the field from a whole variety of different intellectual and disciplinary backgrounds and whole sets of different interests. So, what were yours, and how did you get involved in the field of peace studies, conflict studies, whatever we're going to call it?
I graduated in law at the Faculty of Law here in the University in Oslo, and fairly soon after I had graduated, I became a young university assistant professor at that time, teaching of all things Norwegian contract law and things like that. That's what I was doing for some time, but I then gradually became more interested in international law. And within international law, my main interest was the United Nations and the United Nations Charter and the possibility which it had for regulating and limiting the use of force, and particularly prohibiting the use of aggressive force. And also this was the time when the peacekeeping notions were developed. It's the time of Hammarskjöld, and well, Hammarskjöld already was dead by the time I graduated, but this legacy of the peacekeeping was very important. So I started to study the questions of peacekeeping from an international law point of view, and wrote my first book actually on peacekeeping operations. I did the first study, I think, even internationally on peacekeeping operations, a review of what had been carried out at that time. I worked on this during the early 60s. I published a book on that topic in '65. And at that time, I then started to get in touch with what was then the budding Peace Research Institute here, the PRIO, Peace Research International Oslo, which is Stanford. And after a while, I decided I might as well join them, and I came there, functioned for a while as a director of that institute, PRIO, and stayed on and did a lot of work which, from my perspective, was mainly from international law field, but it became more social science oriented as time went by.
So when you got into this field in the 60s, it was sometimes called peace research, PRIO. People started talking about peace studies, different from peace activism, and then there was another group that called themselves conflict researchers and were interested in conflict analysis. Were you conscious of this distinction, or did it matter? Did it pose any problems at all?
Conflict studies was, of course, important for peace research. Also, and trying to understand the dynamics of conflict and the causes. However, I think it was a clear value orientation that the task was to identify conditions for a peaceful resolution to conflict, peaceful transformation or peaceful resolution of conflict. So the overarching aim was the peaceful management or solution of the conflict. And conflict studies could, of course, share the same view, but essentially they were more interested in the analysis of the conflict for its own sake. And you might have all kinds of conflict studies. Strategic studies could very well be defined as conflict studies, and that could go all the way to fairly militant kind of conflict studies. So, but there were certainly some meeting grounds, but the difference in emphasis was very much on the value orientation of peace research.
So you'd have put yourself sort of firmly in the peace.
We were on the peace side, and the name Peace Research Institute was quite deliberate.
Yeah. And several people have said to us that there was difficulty in using the word peace in a title or in what you were doing. It had sort of negative connotations. Was that the case in Oslo in general? I mean, it was the peace research.
The issue was controversial. I mean, it was also politically controversial at the time. It had to do also with the East-West conflict and the Norwegian membership in NATO, which itself was a controversial matter because Norway had a traditionally a very neutral, like Sweden, position to international affairs. The decision to join NATO was controversial in Norway, and which means that there are many people who were against, and they saw this peace research as a way at least to discuss alternatives. But that also meant that those who are strongly in favor of NATO membership also saw it looked upon it with some suspicion. So the word peace and peace research was a controversial theme.
Well, it's, we've talked to some people who said that they deliberately avoided using the word peace for fear of...
But it was deliberately used in this case, but with a strong aim.
It was acknowledged to be something of a problem then, to use the word.
I can see that.
I mean, the other implication of it is, it has always been, and I've had people say this to me, you know, peace research, conflict research. I mean, you're really just a set of utopian dreamers, and it's the idea that I guess we've always had wars. There'll always be wars. What are you doing? So there's always been the sort of dreamer versus realist aspect to things. Were Prio a set of dreamers?
There were some mix of people, and some maybe slightly more on the dreaming side. Others were much more realistic in the sense of looking for things that could be done, but with a hope and a view and a vision. And some other things became possible. And by now the word peace is very popular in Norway.
Håkon Wiberg, I think, somewhere or other talks about there being 4 tribes associated with this whole field or discipline or whatever it is. There's a security studies tribe, then there's the conflict studies tribe, then there's the international relations tribe, and then there's the peace studies tribe. He says sometimes they're in cooperation with one another, sometimes they work together, sometimes they're at furious odds with one another. So conflict among the conflict resolvers.
Yes.
Okay, so in these you came from a law background.
Yes.
In these early days, there were, a number of very major influences that started to turn. It was a very heterogeneous set of ideas into a field or even a discipline. So, can you think back to some of the other major influences that, for example, affected Prio in those days? I mean, they weren't all lawyers, I recall. No,
on the contrary. I mean, it was I was an odd man out being a lawyer at that time, yes. Because the dominant figure at Prio in the early days was Johan Galton. And he was a social scientist, sociologist, basically. And there were other social science, sociologists and political scientists dominated the Prio group, even though there were anthropologists and some others. But purely legal was mainly, well, there were some others who came in, but it was I was more or less the only one who did systematic legal studies at the time. Now, with regard to the 4 tribes, Yes, there certainly were differences of view. There was in Oslo there was the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, which at that time was very much involved in the study of the East-West conflict and the role of Norway in that.
Now, was that Nils Orvik? Was he
Nils
there?
Orvik, yes.
He was there at the time, I think I remember. They started Conflict and Cooperation at the journal, I think.
Yeah, exactly, yes. And another key figure was Johan Jørgen Holst, who many years later became the Minister of Foreign Affairs, but he was very, very capable, but from strategic studies point of view, counting missiles, as we said. This was at that time when that was a very important question. Because you must remember, take into account that this was during the Cold War. It was the East-West conflict was the major concern. The potential for nuclear war was still very present in our mind, and I think that both for me and for several others, a major motivation was to find ways to avoid anything escalating into that kind of thing. And I, for one, saw the peacekeeping activities as it was at time as a way of avoiding conflicts from escalating.
You mentioned social sciences a couple of minutes ago, particularly with connection with Johan. Were you all trying to turn peace research into a social science? I mean, what was the sort of intellectual hope that lay behind all of this work? Was it to produce a science of peace or something like that? Or is that to attribute too clear a vision to a very diverse group of people?
Well, we certainly tried, all of us, to have an understanding and conception of conflict dynamics and conflict resolution, and to develop methods for understanding that. But apart from that, we all wanted to use our own background to try to make a contribution. Maybe we were thinking, at least I was thinking, quite pragmatic about this. I had an academic career, but it was my interest to use it for the peace-related purposes and to use my special qualifications to work on that. So I was not very deeply involved in trying to merge this into one discipline. I definitely consider it important that I had some methods I could use, and the others had methods they could use, and we were all making use of it. And then we had communications. It was more of an interdisciplinary, maybe to some extent multidisciplinary, but not really transdisciplinary.
Yeah, I have my own sort of division of the field into tribes, which is a much simpler one, which is those that count and those that don't.
I see.
I mean, there used to be, in my memory anyway, a very clear distinction between those who thought that quantitative methods would be the key to everything, and those who poo-pooed that idea.
Yeah, that's right.
You mentioned communications, and one of the impressions that we have from talking to a lot of people was that at this time in the 60s, there were a number of different centres growing up, and we're curious about how they actually communicated with one another and what were some of the important connection points, communication points, other scholars in other countries. So how did it look from Oslo? How did you reach out to the rest of the world and expect the rest of the world to become cognizant of what you were doing these days. Conferences, personal contacts, what were important for you and for others at PRIO?
PRIO was very much involved in international cooperation, and there were coming and going of scholars from many parts of the world, from the United States, from other countries in Europe, from Africa, and from Asia, and also, even though with some difficulties, from the then Eastern Europe.
Oh, you built bridges across.
Well, we were very eager to develop scholarly contacts.
Was that difficult at the time?
Not too difficult. It was, of course, more complicated than it is now, but it was not too difficult. And we also worked through the PUGWAS framework, which I'm sure you are familiar with. And PUGWAS was able to develop contact between outstanding scientists on both sides. Oh, what was then the Iron Curtain. So it was a lot of contact, and you may know that there was an association set up for peace researchers.
I'm going to ask you about IPRA. When did you get involved with that?
Well, I got involved in already I became familiar with it at the end of the 60s, and then I was asked to be the Secretary General of that association, which I think must have been in '71, if I'm not now mistaken. And I had that function for until '77. Yes, yeah.
I think you took a deliberate decision to actually hold the conferences, not in Europe and not in North America, if I remember rightly.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah. It's always struck me, though, that I know IPRA has made strenuous efforts to sort of reach out to other parts of the world, but that still seems to me to be difficult to involve, particularly scholars from Latin America and Africa and the Far East. Peace research and conflict research still seems to be very much a sort of North American, European game, though sort of spotty in Europe as well. Not every country seems to be involved in it. Did you? You had, I think, colleagues from Germany. You had colleagues from Poland. But nothing from France at that time, if I remember rightly.
No, there was a center, what I call polemology, which was the name they gave to studies of peace and conflict. Yeah. But it was not a deep we had some, but not very deep.
And of course, there was the Institute at Groningen, which had that name, I think.
That because of Röling in particular. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I want to go back, and you mentioned another word a few minutes ago, which was sort of multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary, which you think it wasn't. Everybody has, well, not everybody, but a lot of people always said, peace research, conflict research, it has to be multidisciplinary. But it's all very well saying that. The implication is that we borrow a lot of ideas from other fields. Can you think of anything in those days, in the 60s, early 70s, that was particularly useful to you at PRIO and then at IPRA? Ideas, theories that struck you at the time, or was it rather a pragmatic approach that you had?
Well, by and large, it was a pragmatic approach, but I found these efforts to analyze conflict dynamics and conflict outcomes, which was developed, I think, by Galtung and his associates. I found that very useful. Also, his theories about structural violence was quite seminal, very, very important.
Okay, talking about Johan again for a moment. I believe his first post as a professor of peace at the universities was actually funded by the Norwegian government, and in many parts of the world, including the United States, I think, anything that is funded by the government is automatically taken to be perhaps a little undesirable because the government is sort of buying you. But there seems to be a very different attitude in Norway and
Yes.
on possibly Europe on that. That obviously that wasn't a problem for Johan, but is there this difference in sort of government funding?
I think there is a clear difference. Not only was his post funded by the government, but a lot of Prio's budget came from the government, even though there are many times when what came out of Prio was very, very controversial, including in the parliament. But no, there is a different attitude because we don't have this kind of bipartisan approach to the government. We have, of course, governments change, but the administration remains by and large, and the administration is for all Norwegians. And so it's indeed a policy to make sure that there is money available for the plurality of purposes, and it is not looked upon with any particular suspicion. We look with much more suspicion at money which comes from multinational corporations. That we look at with considerable suspicion. So there is an intriguing difference. Or from foundations which have been established by multinational corporations. The government we see as safe because that's neutral, that's impartial.
You start off with peacekeeping in I think they're now calling first generation peacekeeping.
Yes. Yes.
And then went into peace research at Prio and then IPRA, and then you're now in the field of human rights. How did that come about?
Well, I was looking for something that was reasonably solid in terms of having a normative basis where you could argue and articulate and have a common discourse, so to speak. We do have global instruments which in principle are binding on everyone, even though it takes a lot of effort to make them respect these things. But you have it, and you have a possibility for a discourse. And if you take the human rights altogether, not only the civil and political, but also the economic, social, and cultural rights, and see that there's a comprehensive package, which is what I do. I put a lot of effort into that. Then you have a framework where you can discuss worldwide with people who have at least the same standards that in principle universal. And through the advancement of this has been my hope that one reduce the likelihood of serious conflict. That's why I got into it, and I got I think it was particularly during the Carter period in the United States that there was a lot of interest in human rights, because he made that. Of course, we had reacted very strongly against the military coups in Chile and other places during the Nixon period, and Carter seemed to be a very refreshing reaction to all that. So that also spread widely the interests in human rights, including for myself. And I became involved also with the United Nations myself. I became elected to one of the expert bodies and was a member for 20 years there, which made it possible for me also at the level of the United Nations to have considerable impact on a number of things. So that's how I got into that.
Have you ever, this is not in our question schedule, but I'm interested in the effects of human rights law in civil wars, because we're doing some work down in Colombia at the moment, where a lot of the sort of local communities are using human rights law in order to try to set up peace communities and peace zones, and trying to keep the worst effects of the conflict out of their particular municipalities.
That's very important.
Yeah. Do you think, this is an unanswerable question, but I will ask it anyway, how successful do you think you and the human rights movement have been in at least dampening down some of the worst effects of conflict? Are there sort of major things that you can look back on and think, well, that was a success?
I think we have been had an impact on many places, but hopeless. If we take some of the conflicts which arose after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the whole thing, and if you look at the situation in the Balkans and in the Baltics, because we were completely taken back by the violence in first in Croatia and then in Bosnia, and the intensity of that. However, there were also a number of other budding conflicts where the situation could have gotten out of hand, and where the use of human rights and the Office of the High Commissioner on National Minorities, with whom I worked a lot, helped to prevent some of those conflicts from escalating into something serious. So in some places we were successful, in other places, at least initially. Now I think we have a role, and as I told you, I've been for a number of years the president in the Council of Europe, whose task is to see the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of Minorities. And there I think we are fairly successful in that many situations are calming down and under more control. With regard to the situation in Colombia, well, I never was directly involved in Colombia, but I was for a number of years member of the Norwegian delegation negotiating the, this is way back in the 70s, negotiating the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions. And there are two protocols, as you may know. The Protocol 1, which deals with international conflict, and the Protocol 2, which deals with non-international conflicts. And it was our delegation's strong effort. We wanted very much to have strong rules constraining the use of force in internal conflicts, in terms of protection of civilian population, in terms even of protecting the rights of guerrilla soldiers if they were taken prisoners and so on. We worked very hard on that. We didn't get as much as we wanted because there were some strong opponents, but we got some of it. And but definitely this is both the humanitarian law and non-international armed conflict I consider to be extremely important, and also the application of human rights in that connection. So I really wish you all good luck in that.
Well,
I know how difficult Colombia is. A friend of mine who is now Under Secretary General in the United Nations, Jan Egeland, he worked on Colombia.
That's right. All right. One of the characteristics of the field, whether we're calling it sort of peace research or conflict research, has been that it's always tried to be practical and applied, not just intellectual and academic. Do you think it's actually succeeded in trying to be a practical subject as well as a one for study?
I think many of the peace researchers have been very active also outside the research field. Ingrid was active in politics. He was a junior minister for a while. He was in parliament. Helge VM has played a very central role in a lot of research on North-South issues, and has had quite an impact, at least on the in the Nordic area, with regard to conceptions and approaches to development cooperation. So I would say that many other people have manifested through their life that they were not simply sitting at the desk doing the studies, but they have been active in many ways.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you yourself exemplify that.
Yeah.
Do you think? Do you think it's been a help being a citizen of a small developed country?
Yes. Yes, I mean, of course, it has many benefits to be from a developed country, firstly. I mean, in the sense of having more possibilities, more resources available. And also in many respects, it's quite useful to be from a small country which doesn't have a number of the negative legacies that some of the bigger countries have. Generally speaking, Norway and the Nordic countries have a kind of a standing internationally, which makes it more easy to operate in many ways. Even during the Cold War, they were relatively neutral, even though Norway was a member of NATO, but not so manifest. I mean, we're trying more to build bridges. And also later on, it has had a kind of a peace image, which it still tries to cultivate, the peace image. And I think this is partly due to the peace research that Norway is trying to cultivate this image. We have the Nobel Peace Prize, and we have you seen the new center which they have established?
Yes, we did the peace tour yesterday.
I see, yes.
We went there. We also went up the hill, of course, to Quisling's old house.
Ah, yes. Which is now a Holocaust center.
Right, yes. Well, I mean, Norway is still very active. I have a student who's doing a project on Sri Lanka, and of course the Norwegian initiative there is it's stalled at the moment. The place is going to hell in a handcart, but at least the Norwegian government and the delegation there has been very, very important and very influential in that situation.
Yes. Now we have come to have more or less successful engagement in quite a number of countries. Guatemala, for a certain period, and the Norwegian role was quite significant.
It seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong in this, that Norwegian peace researchers, I mean, perhaps PRIO, your own organisation, have been much more successful at interesting the national government in peace work than many other countries where there's a big intellectual peace research movement, conflict research movement, but their ability to influence the government is pretty limited. I don't think the present American government is particularly interested in peace research, but consistently, I think you have been able to. How have you managed this? Have you got any advice for people who are trying to influence governments? I mean, apart from being in Norway.
It is difficult to say, because part of the explanation, if you compare with the United States, is that the United States has more complex strategic interests than a small country. Jan Egeland, who I mentioned, wrote a little book which is quite good in its title. It was a book about the effectiveness of human rights work of Norway and the United States. And the title of his book was Impotent Superpower and Potent Small State. He wrote it during the Carter period and what came out of it and the Reagan takeover. And he saw that the complex interests of the United States stultified even some of the best intentions of Carter because of conflicting interests, which made it a stalemate. Whereas we don't have these conflicting interests in Norway, so it was more easy to be successful.
Interesting. My old boss, of course, was Australian, and always looked at the world, from Australia, and always used to say it looked very different if you came from there, and even coming from London. And he was always arguing that there was a very, very important role for what he called middle powers. And he didn't mean sort of middle-sized or middle wealth. He sort of meant, I think, countries that were in the middle in the sense of not being, on one side or the other of the Cold War or the sort of North-South divide. So he was always gently sort of joking with me about Britain and about the British pretensions to remain a great power and things like that. So.
Now, what do you think about that? I mean, British pretensions to remain.
Oh, I wish they would give it up. I mean, many years ago, there was a group of us in London who got together and wrote a book called, I think it was called A New Britain, A Concerned Independence, and we were arguing for, for trying to take up some kind of a role like Sweden. This was before Britain went into the European community. When the choices were often sort of posed as you either go into Europe or you stay with the Atlantic Alliance, which of course is very important to the British, but it's not very important to the Americans. Having lived in America for 20 odd years, I've found that. The only thing that consistently appeared in the Washington Post before 9/11 anyway was Israel. The only time that Britain appeared in the Washington Post was when there was a royal scandal or when the tennis tournament was on. And that was what Britain meant to most people in America, I think. So I'm afraid I'm not a British imperialist or a neo-imperialist. So anyway, but the reason for my sort of pushing you a little bit on how did you manage to influence Norwegian policy was that we had very little success in influencing British policy over 20 odd years of work. Very, very little success. And I think for the same reason as with the United States, except that in the British case, it was, it was a kind of a charade. Britain had all of these global interests, and we really didn't. We really weren't a player in.
You were living with the pretensions of the past.
Oh yes. I guess it's very difficult to give them up, but there we are. Okay. Thinking back again to those early days, people had hopes and dreams and expectations, and the research, the field was going to affect the world in major ways. I think we hoped. Certainly, that was the way we thought about it in London. Do you think we've fallen short of those aspirations, those hopes and dreams, in any particular way?
Well, certainly we cannot be fully satisfied. There are important positive things which have happened, which may or may not have any relationship to the achievements of peace research. But the Helsinki Accords, which contributed to the end of the Cold War, was very much the work of Willy Brandt, who was at that time the Chancellor in Germany. But he has I don't know whether you know, but he has a strong Norwegian link. He fled Nazi Germany before World War II, and he fled to Norway, and he became a refugee in Norway. Of course, when the Germans occupied Norway, he, like other, also many Norwegians, fled to Sweden. And he stayed on in Sweden with the Norwegians. And when the war was over, his first period, he was very closely tied up with the Norwegians, and he was a journalist in one of the Norwegian newspapers the first period after World War II. And then he went back to Germany and became a politician and ended up as a chancellor. And well, I knew him personally, and I'm not taking any credit, but the way in which he developed this framework of communication with the East European countries fits well with our thinking about peace research, in that developed ideas of what would be reciprocal interest on the Eastern side. They were very interested in collaboration in the scientific and technological field, and wanted very
rather
much
like pugwash, I guess.
yeah, very
similar.
pugwash also. I mean, and so peace research, pugwash, these were all things that mingled together for us at that time. And the communication and the dialogue which developed on that, and which, in my opinion, facilitated a transformation without any armed conflict, except those local conflicts, which were, of course, extremely brutal and completely unexpected, because but it was not related to the big issue.
No.
So that was a positive development. I'm not able to point to very particular ways in which we influenced it, but
any disappointments?
Yes. Yes. Generally speaking, a disappointment is the declining interest of young people in value-oriented research, particularly in academia. I think there was more enthusiasm, more interest, at least, but maybe all people think that way. But I don't see so much interest among young people for, I mean, they want to have a career, they want to have money. So that's a little disappointment. On the positive side, as I already said, we had not expected that the end of the Cold War would be so simple and so non-violent in its overall. We were, of course, deeply concerned with what happened in former Yugoslavia. Particularly because we had a lot of contacts there. There were many people we knew very well. We had seminars very often in Dubrovnik.
Of course, yes. Darko. Yeah.
So for us, that came as a very, and we couldn't really understand that it would turn so violent as it did. But the overall, the broader framework was. On the other hand, another disappointment is that the kind of transition which took place in both in what is now the Russian Federation, particularly in the Russian Federation, is not the kind of transition we had hoped for. During the last years of the Soviet Union, during the Gorbachev period, in the late 1980s, I was several times in Moscow attending seminars where they were discussing the future. And the people around Gorbachev was looking for a transition towards something comparable to the Nordic countries, which would be a combination of a welfare system and a market but welfare system. And of course we tried to encourage, and we tried to show that what the communist propaganda had portrayed as the evils of the Western system was not true, because there were a protection of the workers and all these kind of things. But then what actually came out of the transition was a fairly raw capitalism. And so that was...
yes, and encouraged by the Harvard boys, as we called them.
Absolutely. So that was, of course, then a great setback.
Would you like to say something about what you would like to see as future lines of development in the field? What would be important to you that we do over the next 10, 20 years?
I think the best one can hope for is more communication between different people who may be following their own respective, maybe this is reflecting my own path. What I don't see a very strong, consolidated peace discipline, which is methodologically very coherent. But what I hope and expect is that there will be good communications between people who have these different contributions to make to the field. So if you can provide frameworks for multidisciplinary work, where you look at projects and programs and facilitate the communication between different people, that is what I think one can hope for.
And any specific, what would you like to see as the subject of that kind of work? Do you have any?
We certainly need more work and understanding on how you can transform these local conflicts into something constructive and useful. And then we need to know and understand much better how to deal with the negative consequences of globalization, how to empower those who are presently the losers in that big game. The whole globalization process in itself is the major transformation which is going on, and there are so many unclear implications. There are many positive consequences in that we facilitate communication globally in a completely different way from what we could do before. But there are also many very complicated tensions arising from it. So, to chart out the research which is required to study the globalization and the way to address it, that's the big field of the future.
That's a tall order.
Very tall.